The storm hit Rikers Island before sunrise. Rain slammed against the razor wire, thunder shook the guard towers, and the East River swelled dangerously close to the narrow bridge that connected the island to the rest of New York City. Inmates inside the decaying buildings pressed their faces against tiny windows, watching as water pooled in the yard and lightning lit up the skyline. At 4:17 a.m. the power went out. The lights blinked once, twice, and then the entire complex fell into darkness. The hum of the generators sputtered, failed, and died. Inside the cell blocks, the silence was heavier than the storm outside. For the first time in years, Rikers Island, America's most notorious jail, was completely dark. Officers scrambled down corridors with flashlights, shouting orders. Inmates banged on their doors, some yelling, some laughing, some terrified. A single voice echoed through the hallway, "Yo, we trapped in here." When the emergency lights finally flickered back on, the world looked red. Red alarms. Red shadows. Red panic. For months, the city had promised that Rikers Island was entering a new era. The mayor called it the future of reform. But that morning, everything looked like the past: chaos, fear, and confusion. The control room phones rang nonstop. The rainwater had flooded one of the main electrical panels. Surveillance cameras were down in 2 housing units. And in the medical wing, an elevator stalled with 3 people inside, 1 officer and 2 inmates. A captain yelled into his radio, "Get the backup power online." But the generator was in the basement, and the basement was underwater. By dawn, the storm was easing, but the damage was already done. Rikers Island was cut off. The bridge was flooded, the phones barely worked, and dozens of correctional officers couldn't reach the facility. Inside, over 4,000 inmates sat in darkness, unsure what would happen next. That day, the headlines would call it the Rikers blackout of 2025. But inside the walls, it felt like something more, a warning. 3 days earlier, everything had seemed calm. Mayor Leon Price stood at a press conference in front of City Hall, cameras flashing as he announced his new plan, the Rikers Transformation Initiative. His words were full of promise. "We are rebuilding, not abandoning, our correctional system," he said. By 2027, Rikers Island will represent a new model for American justice. Behind him stood a row of smiling officials, but not everyone shared his optimism. Outside the barricades, a group of protesters shouted, "Shut it down." They held signs reading "Rikers kills and justice, not jails." Reporters later asked the mayor if he really thought Rikers could be fixed. He smiled and said, "It has to be." Inside the jail, though, the staff rolled their eyes. They'd heard promises before. Jamal, now a year into his sentence, leaned against the wall of his dorm and said to a fellow inmate, "They can paint it, rename it, whatever. It's still Rikers." In the officer's lounge, a tired guard named Rivera agreed. "You can't rebuild a ghost," he muttered. Even with new cameras, digital monitoring, and reform training, the daily reality stayed the same. Cells leaked when it rained. The cafeteria still served cold beans. Fights still broke out over phone calls. But the storm that week changed everything. When the power first went out, the correctional officers tried to maintain order. Rivera walked through the dorm shouting, "Stay calm. Lights will be back soon." But after 30 minutes, the air grew thick with fear. The buzz of the fluorescent lights was gone, replaced by the sound of dripping water and shuffling feet. In the darkness, voices carried, angry, mocking, restless. Someone started kicking their door. Then another joined in. The metal clanging echoed down the corridor until it sounded like thunder inside the walls. From his cell, Jamal whispered to himself, "If they can't control this, it's over." Outside, floodwater crept into the main generator room. Sparks flickered from broken cables. Officers struggled to reach the controls, their boots sloshing in ankle-deep water. Rivera's flashlight beam danced across a wall of warning lights that were all blinking red. "This place ain't built for the future," he said under his breath. "It can barely survive the present." Hours later, as dawn broke, the mayor received an emergency call. The news was grim. No power, no transport, no backup. Rikers Island, the jail he'd promised to transform, was once again on the brink of disaster. Reporters gathered outside City Hall by mid-morning, demanding answers. Was anyone hurt? How could this happen again after billions in reform funding? The mayor stood at the podium, pale and uneasy. "We're assessing the situation," he said. "All inmates and staff are safe." But inside that wasn't true. In the West facility, the temperature was dropping fast. The power outage killed the heat, and by noon the cells were cold enough to see breath. An officer tried to calm a group of men shouting for blankets. "They're on the way," she said, but she knew they weren't. In another building, the stalled elevator still hadn't been fixed. The men inside banged on the metal walls, yelling for help. By afternoon, rumors spread like wildfire: "The bridge is gone. The city forgot us. They're gonna leave us here." For hours, everyone waited, officers, inmates, medical staff, listening for the sound of engines, helicopters, anything. But all they heard was rain hitting the roof. Then, just after 6 p.m., a loud crack echoed across the island. The ground shook. An old transformer near the yard exploded in a burst of sparks and flame. The entire north wing went dark again. From his cell, Jamal saw the flash through his tiny window. For a split second, the whole yard lit up white, then went black. He whispered, "That's not the future they promised." And as smoke rose from the far side of the island, Rivera shouted into his dead radio, "We need help, now." But no one answered. The city's most notorious jail, the one they said would become a symbol of change, was once again isolated, powerless, and burning in the dark. And this time the world was watching. By sunrise, Rikers Island looked less like a jail and more like a disaster zone. Helicopters circled overhead. News crews gathered across the East River with long camera lenses aimed at the island. The city called it a temporary systems failure. But inside, everyone knew better. The new Rikers was falling apart faster than ever. The smoke from the exploded transformer drifted into the sky like a warning signal. Inmates watched from their cell windows, some cheering, others terrified. The officers moved slower that morning, their radios still unreliable. Even the generators that did work ran with a loud, uneven hum, flickering the lights every few minutes. Rivera hadn't slept. He stood near the central hallway, rubbing his eyes and trying to drink cold coffee from a cracked paper cup. The hallway smelled of wet concrete, burned plastic, and sweat. A younger officer walked up beside him. "They said help's coming," the officer said quietly. Rivera shook his head. "They've been saying that for 20 years. Across the yard, Jamal was herded with a group of inmates toward the cafeteria for morning count. He could feel the tension in the air, not just from the storm or the blackout, but from the sense that the island itself was on edge. He whispered to another inmate, "If the city can't fix this, they're gonna shut it down for good." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if that would make anything better. The cafeteria lights flickered, buzzing like dying insects. The food was cold and gray, a scoop of oatmeal, a banana, and water in a paper cup. The men sat quietly, eating in near silence. Then, out of nowhere, someone at the back slammed a tray down. "Cold food again?" the voice yelled. "Y'all said things were changing." Rivera rushed over, his boots echoing on the floor. "Sit down," he ordered. But it was too late, the room was already shifting. Inmates stood up, one after another, voices rising. "Where's the reform? Why we freezing in here? You said this was the new Rikers." The noise built like a wave, bouncing off the concrete walls. Rivera raised his radio, but it was dead again. He turned toward the nearest officer, yelling, "Call Central." The officer shook his head. "Signal's out." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then slowly one inmate, the same one who had slammed his tray, sat back down. One by one, others followed. The sound of metal trays hitting the tables echoed through the cafeteria. Rivera exhaled and wiped sweat from his forehead. "We can't keep doing this," he muttered. That afternoon, city officials finally arrived on the island by boat. The bridge was still closed for repairs, so they came wearing safety vests and polished shoes that were quickly ruined by the mud. They met with the warden in a small, dimly lit office still running on backup power. A government representative spoke first. "This can't happen again," she said, slamming a folder onto the table. "We were supposed to be moving forward. This looks like a step back into the 1990s. The warden nodded slowly. "We warned them about the infrastructure. Half these systems are older than me." The mayor joined by video call, his face pale on the flickering monitor. "We can't afford another Rikers scandal," he said. "Fix it." Quietly. But fixing Rikers wasn't simple. As the officials argued, Jamal sat in the yard watching the sky. The rain had stopped, but puddles still glimmered across the cracked pavement. Inmates walked in small circles, whispering to each other. One man pointed to the skyline in the distance, Manhattan glowing in the morning sun. "They talk about reform, but we're still here," he said. Jamal didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, thinking about how close freedom looked, and how far it really was. That night, Rivera went to check the south building where most of the damage had happened. The air still smelled like burnt wires. The The power flickered every few minutes and the walls were damp from flooding. In one cell, a man tapped on the bars. "Hey CO," he said, "they ever fix this place?" Rivera stopped and looked at him. "They've been fixing it my whole career." The man laughed softly. "Then maybe it's time they stopped trying." Rivera didn't respond. He walked to the end of the corridor looking out at the river. The city lights shimmered across the water, a city that wanted to forget this island existed. The next morning, the mayor made another announcement, a new proposal to finally close Rikers Island by 2029. It was the third such promise in less than 10 years. On TV, the headlines read, "Rikers Island, a future reimagined." In reality, the future looked the same: gray walls, broken systems, exhausted guards, and men counting days until trial. Jamal saw the press conference on the small TV in the common area. The mayor's voice echoed through static, "This time we mean it." Carlos, another inmate, chuckled. "They've been saying that since before I got locked up." "Yeah," Jamal said, "but maybe this time the place won't survive long enough to break the promise." At that moment, a loud crash came from outside, a piece of ceiling plaster falling near the stairwell. Dust filled the air and the lights flickered again. Everyone went quiet. Then someone laughed bitterly. The future just fell from the ceiling. By evening, a small group of officers gathered in the staff lounge. Rivera sat with his coffee, staring at a newspaper headline, "Can Rikers be reformed or should it be replaced?" He looked around at his colleagues. Some were new, others had worked there for decades. One said, "They'll never close it. Too many people depend on it staying open." Rivera didn't answer. He looked out the barred window toward the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly. Days later, as the cleanup crews worked to restore power, one of the electricians found something unusual near the flooded basement, a rusted plaque half buried in debris. He wiped off the dirt and read the faded words aloud. "Rikers Island Correctional Facility, rebuilt for a safer tomorrow." It was dated 1991. The man laughed under his breath and placed it back down. "Guess tomorrow never came," he said. Above him, thunder rumbled again, soft but steady, the sound of another storm rolling in from the Atlantic. On the surface, the power had returned. But deep down, in the walls and wires and air of Rikers Island, the same problems still pulsed like electricity waiting to surge again. And as night fell, the red warning lights along the hallway flickered one last time, glowing against the darkness like a heartbeat that refused to stop.